Yo, what's up, Miss Quinn? That was my little intro. Hope it looks good. I don't know if it's gonna look good, but hope it looks good. I feel like a YouTuber right now. I'm not gonna lie. Okay, yo. So this is my biography of liberalism. It's gonna be video essay, pictures, videos of events and stuff to keep you engaged. Maybe like a little, a little more, little sound effects. Gonna have like words in the screen and stuff to keep you engaged. The first area. I like to call this time of liberalism the pregnancy up until birth, basically. It hasn't been made yet, but it's growing. It's going through each trimester. You know what I'm saying? This would be all the events and thoughts that happened to create the beginning of liberalism. It's a long and very detailed history, but this will be a brief summary of all that happened. The birth of baby liberalism. So before I get into it, I should say that the term classical liberalism is used to indicate the original ideals of liberalism. Ultimately, it stresses the importance of human rationality and values political freedoms as well as advocates for free market. This is accompanied and relies on limited government and the rational choices of citizens with their own self-interest. I like to use this timeline of the European ideas that eventually combined and led to form classical liberalism. It's a timeline that's from the textbook as well. Hopefully I can find a picture up on there, but if not, just kind of imagine it. So basically it goes like this. 14th to 16th century is the Renaissance, 1517, the Protestant Reformation, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution during the 1700s. Then we have the Enlightenment. Then we have the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th century. And basically, with all this history, we could consider these the ancestors of liberalism. So this history basically all culminates to the two main parents, which are Enlightenment, which is the political parent, and the Industrial Revolution, which is the economic parent.
Honey, I think it's time we have a talk.
About what, baby?
Well, I just created politics.
Yeah, and I also just created economics.
And you know what that means, right? I think it's time that we create classical liberalism!
9 months later.
The Renaissance sparked a belief in the importance of the individual, and the Reformation reflected the belief that reason was as significant as faith. These trends helped promote the rise of Enlightenment. Enlightenment helped curate the beliefs of classical liberalism, but the Enlightenment had roots in the Renaissance. So both had thinkers that investigated logic and reason, emphasized the importance of arts and literature, purpose of life, structures of society based on reason rather than religion. They were humanists. The Reformation altered political, economic, and social circumstances of Europe, challenging the hierarchical structure and concentrated religious and corrupt power of the Catholic Church. European turmoil in the 17th century emerged from the ideas of the role of the individual and the use of logic over faith. As these ideas emerged, existing power structures were crumbling, meaning that feudal economic order was being replaced. A middle class emerged as private ownership began and great urbanization occurred. In these turbulent times of religious wars and an age of reason, classical liberalism focused on allowing citizens the right to freedom in their economic, political, and social lives. At this point in time, the thinkers who contributed to the ideology of liberalism were people like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Charles de Montesquieu, John Stuart Mill, Adam Smith, other philosophers. I can't really get into them as much, but basically the main ones were John Locke, John Stuart Mill, and Adam Smith. Adam Smith created laissez-faire economics. He spent time with physiocrats who opposed mercantilism, and so this helped Adam curate the beliefs within laissez-faire economic competition, economic freedom, and opportunity. Limited government, self-interest. He basically believed that the government's role should be limited to maintaining the rule of law. Classical liberal thought and its fundamental beliefs were developed from the thinking of individuals like Locke, Montesquieu, Smith, and Mill, who considered protecting the rights and freedoms of citizens. The American and French Revolution were attempts at implementing the ideas of liberal thought, ultimately having those principles involved in society institutionally. The Industrial Revolution. Basically, The Industrial Revolution specifically describes Britain, but also the world's transition from an agricultural, mercantile society to a modern industrial one. Technological advancements led to the mechanization of agriculture and industry, and individual entrepreneurs and inventors started to become more efficient and profitable. The Enclosure Act of 1801 allowed for privatization of land. The capital gained from years of imperialism and colonialization led to the creation of factories, steam engines, fly shuttles, the spinning jenny, water frames, power looms, etc. were all machines that changed the textile and cottage industry. As innovation, production, and development grew at an increasing rate, liberal ideology was woven into this expansion as time went on. As society progressed industrially, a great amount of urbanization occurred, with people who used to live in fields working manual labor under feudalism are now moving to the city. However, this great population move changed class structure. Growing professions like bankers, retailers, factory owners, lawyers, engineers were controlling the land that dominated societal structure. The nouveau rich, they were called, with the newly wealthy showing off their riches with ostentatious lifestyles. On the other hand, factory working laborers were living in horrible lifestyles and work conditions, which we'll get into more later on. And so, that's the beginning of liberalism. Combination between Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. Other combination of the thinkers that created this philosophy of liberalism created classical liberalism. This is basically teenagehood to young adulthood for liberalism. It's still relatively new after its invention. This was its growing stage, and it was very rough. You could compare this with a moody teen going through all its normal experiences of pain, embarrassment, cringe, and triumph. At this point, liberalism has not been fully established and is still in its fundamental ideas and implementation. So there were multiple attempts of ideologies and movements that opposed laissez-faire economics and classical liberalism and its inhumane products toward regular working people. At this point, society was emphasizing industrial efficiency and the accumulation of wealth. These goals were considered more important than equality. Workers of these factories are viewed as one component of production. Limited government prevented regulation to these industries. So decent wages or working conditions did not occur. So, opponents of liberalism flourished in these circumstances, and a number of new left-leaning socialist ideologies arose. Firstly, there were grassroots movements, which were movements that didn't really become ideology. These movements consisted of groups like the Luddites, which is a movement that destroyed machines to protest against machines taking their job. The Chartists was a movement consisting of a group of working class people who were really ahead of their time. You know what I'm saying? The policies that they advocated for were things like universal suffrage for all men under 21, equal-sized electoral districts, voting by secret ballot, ending property qualifications for parliament, and having annual elections. Way ahead of their time. This is like during like the 1800s, like 1700s, like crazy that they were thinking about this. You get what I'm saying? And so, these movements provided a turning point in the transformation of classical liberalism, or changes hormonally in our teenage puberty, with increasingly more socialist movements and ideologies uprising. The starting point for socialist ideologies was a reform of the political, social, and economic structures of the 19th century. And so, just to give a quick rundown, socialism is an ideology that believes that resources should be controlled by the public for the public good. It's separate from individualism. This is mostly based off collectivist ideas and is very separate from individuals. Socialists also rejected the lack of equality and humanitarianism and classical liberalism and deplored the social injustices that resulted. First off, for utopian social created by Robert Owen utopian socialists were idealists rather than pragmatic humanitarians who advocated for an end to the appalling conditions of the average worker in the industrial capitalist countries of the time. So, Robert Owen, a mill manager, created a village that was a utopian socialist society using his own capital to implement these ideals. Ultimately, it didn't really continue, but and then we had Marxism, created by Karl Marx. Major. Marxism is a radical form of communism in which the only way to overthrow capitalism is by means of class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Karl Marx advocated for revolution to make necessary change, and that the means of production are to be held by the proletariat, and in turn had hoped this would create a classless society. Examples of Marxist ideologies to an extent include the Soviet Union, China, or Korea, which each developed a centrally planned economy. Then we have classical conservatism, which is created by M. Burke, which is basically and maintaining of status quo, preserving old institutions, and having educated people control the masses. Then, this is major. We have welfare capitalism. At first, these were temporary solutions or modifications used to consider the rights of workers and develop a social conscience. Welfare capitalism referred to a classical liberal economic system combined with a government that used legislation to give worker protections such as limited worker hours, minimum wage, a safety net like pensions or medical insurance. However, this never sought to actually benefit the workers. For example, George Pullman, this rich guy, built a village for his workers, similar to that of Robert Owen, but his goal was to prevent labor unrest by responding to some of his workers' complaints. The village wasn't civil friendly. You get what I'm saying? Yeah. And so, the legislative journey to worker rights was a long one, with gradual change and policy implementation spanning almost all of the 19th century. Examples include Factory Acts in 1810, which did things like decrease work hours, increase worker age. Maternity leave and old age assistance wasn't introduced until 1883. Relativism didn't take place until Theodore Roosevelt's Square Deal, and is designed to decrease the excessive control laissez-faire economics had and bridge the gap between both labor and capital. This new kind of liberalism was called progressivism, as classical liberalism began to transform with more citizen unrest and the Great Depression, which we'll get to later on. Equality among all citizens was extended. Labor standards and labor unions were created. Universal suffrage was gradually being extended to all groups of people, and equality rights for women like feminism was emerging, giving the same rights of men to women. Ultimately, we get to the welfare state, which was the fully incorporated institutional implementation of grassrootism and collectivist/leftist ideals away from laissez-faire economics. Basically, the Great Depression was a catalyst for change, a moment of realization that was the emergence of what we know now as modern liberalism. So the solution was an economic theory created by John Maynard Keynes called Keynesian economics or demand-side economics. Basic theory was that to avoid the destructive and unpredictable wave of the unregulated market, during times of high inflation, high employment, or recession, he called it, the government would have to spend money in order to combat deficit spending, he called it, on things like infrastructure. They would also lower rates to stimulate spending from citizens and regulate banks, which would help incentivize people to spend money without putting themselves in a hole. This government regulation and deficit spending was called fiscal policy. Keynes argued that even in a liberal democratic society, the government could and should play an important role in safeguarding all citizens from economic uncertainty. Franklin D. Roosevelt would be the first president to implement these ideals during the 1930s, creating a societal shift towards how people viewed government intervention. He called his policies the New Deal, which is a series of public programs and infrastructure projects that provided further jobs, provided emergency relief programs, and reformed the banking system. So after World War II, a new attitude towards the government's role in the economy began to shift, with people beginning to recognize that free market principles could be combined with some degree of government intervention. This is a combination of chapter 5 and 6. This period in time for liberalism I consider to be its midlife crisis, a time where it's having these internal struggles, questioning its identity and coming to a breaking point before making a major transformation. So during the late 19th to early 20th century, we have these injustices being placed on certain societies created by the uncontrolled free market capitalism and or the living of authoritarian regimes created a plethora of different groups of people to reject liberalism in its entirety. Countries like the USSR, Germany, who were subject to incompetent and discriminatory rule under their authoritarian leaders, alongside this failed or exploited system of the free market, for example by the bourgeoisie or ruling elite, created this attitude of hatred towards capitalism within these specific countries. Thus, we saw the rise of communism in the USSR by the Bolsheviks. First was Vladimir Lenin, and ultimately Joseph Stalin for most of the 20th century, and the rise of fascism in Germany, Hitler and his Nazis. Both totalitarian, both using abusive rule to gain power, both xenophobic, committing great genocide. But mainly, these specific countries had two separate types of economic systems. Stalin's USSR had a centrally planned economy with heavy industrialization and total public control, and Hitler's Germany with a tight big business and state cooperative control alongside limited international trade. Ultimately, after the uprising of these ideologies, we have a continuation of this midlife crisis, what I like to call the climax in liberalism's life, a fight between upholding and or maintaining this mixed welfare economy had in the West and the authoritative centrally planned rule of communism in Eastern Europe and the USSR. The Cold War encapsulates the sentiment I just provided. Is gradually building tension between two superpowers, providing strategic aid to other divided countries, creating factions or teams of ideologies, dividing Europe in half and even building a physical barrier around Berlin to highlight the division between each ideology. Acts of espionage and spies traveling in enemy territory to gain information, and the constant fear-mongering, the great amount of nuclear production, almost leading to the destruction of the entire planet. The result was liberalism coming out on top. So, modern liberalism, in my own words, could be described as a combination of free market principles that allow for government intervention at different points in time, with both not overbearing each other unless needed to. The fluctuation between both collectivist and individualist ideals, both at the same time. This alongside the accumulation of equalities that have been addressed throughout liberalism's life, like civil rights, feminism, climate change, workers' rights, racial equality, economic equality, and this allowment and acceptance of new ideas that allow for innovation and better discourse among each other. However, I think today's modern liberalism, in my opinion, is coming to an end. The class inequality and financial disparity between the rich and poor worldwide is getting greater and greater every day. Developing countries are either lacking to keep up with the rest of the world, still recovering from the effects of colonial rule and being a stage for proxy wars or exploitation, and still operating with corrupt or outdated government. Multinational corporations are only expanding further, like Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Costco, Walmart, not only monopolizing their specific industries, but with the way they operate with unethical labor standards like sweatshops. They also provide a great detriment to the climate with pollution. Political discourse is getting rather more ambiguous and emotional than logical and productive, making policy decisions by politicians harder. The validity of information is becoming harder to come by nowadays. To me, it seems as if greed, selfishness, ignorance, and emotionality has consumed the world. And in part, the political and economic systems of modern-day liberalism seem to be the main culprit. I don't know what change would need to be provided today to make all this go away. Time can only tell. But as of right now, that's my biography of liberalism. Hope you enjoy it. Subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment on anything. All my sources, the textbook will be in the description, hopefully. Peace!